events that have been happening in the past week and maybe give you a flavor of some of the things which are going to be coming in the next week. We are going to talk a little bit about Apple's prospective ambitions in television. Also, the product event tomorrow is going to be heavily Mac focused, and we'd of course be delighted to hear any questions that you guys have. We'll do our best to answer them. But let's kick off with some small points. There was some news we've had in the past week. Mark had a really great story about what Apple's up to in its car business in Canada. I don't know if you want to maybe run through some of the main points.
Sure, we had a great story where Apple is working on sort of the software core, the main operating system, as the iPhone is to applications. This would be the car operating system to car applications, and this would basically be the underpinnings of what they would run the self-driving platform that Alex and I first wrote about in July. And it's very interesting because they're doing it in QNX's backyard in the same office park.
And QNX, of course, a unit of BlackBerry. BlackBerry having its own problems in mobile phones, and so QNX was one of the few jewels left in the crown, so losing talent to Apple.
It's not good. It's not good for BlackBerry, and BlackBerry stock took a very slight hit after the story because it was indicating that people are leaving, as you said, the crown jewel for Apple's new or future crown jewel, whatever they're working on in the car space.
They would like it to be the crown jewel.
Right, exactly.
Of course, we also had yesterday Apple's earnings, the full year earnings essentially, but the fourth quarter, and the stock wasn't terribly happy this morning. As a consequence, the market wasn't terribly happy. The expectation was perhaps they would give us slightly punchier guidance, more ambitious goals for the fourth calendar quarter, but Apple's first quarter. That's the 3 months heading into Christmas. There had been a hope that given Samsung's problems, these exploding phones spontaneously bursting into flames, that Apple would be able to grab a huge amount more market share. Apple was a little bit less confident about that, and they also made some interesting arguments in the call about the case. I mean, do you want to run through perhaps currency and a few other issues?
Sure, and Alex had the best coverage of the earnings call. You spoke with
a little bit too generous, perhaps, but I'll take it.
Sure, CFO Luca Maestri, and speaking of the Samsung thing you mentioned, he was talking about how Apple is not really able to take advantage of it because of the supply of the iPhone 7 Plus in particular, which is really the main rival to the Galaxy Note, both the phablet screen size. Talked about currency fluctuations, how China revenues are down 30%. Go ahead.
And there was, of course, another Samsung factor, namely that last year, in the equivalent quarter, they received approximately $548 million, a fine payment from essentially damages from Samsung for patent infringement. And that, of course, means that it's $548 million they're not going to be getting this year, which makes it a little bit harder then to meet those, to grow in a significant way compared to last year's numbers.
Right, absolutely. I mean, it's only $500 million, and we say only because, Apple is the context here. They have so much cash, but it still makes a difference. That extra $500 million, if Apple didn't have that last year, this quarter would have been a beat, right?
And I think, yes, and I think we'll have to see about beat.
On revenue growth year over year.
Yeah. But we'd be interested to hear perhaps your thoughts if you are unable to buy a Samsung Note 7, which of course is now the case. What would you prefer to buy? Perhaps the new iPhone 7, or would you be looking at Google's Pixel? Be interested to hear your thoughts on that and any other questions you might have. Another comment on the call was there's some questions about Apple's ambitions in television. Of course, there's an interesting context to this.
Right. Tim Cook was asked a lot about Apple's future plans, the grand scheme or the grand strategy, so to speak. But in terms of TV, he basically said, I can confirm Apple's interest or immense interest in the TV space, along with other people on the Apple executive team being interested. And, Apple's shown over the past few years this increasing interest. They came out with an Apple TV with Siri, an App Store, a whole new platform, and great remote control, motion sensing, and gaming. So they're really showing that. But there obviously is a next step to take. And one of the interesting things is how content has been making Apple king in terms of the music industry early on and having the most apps and what they call the best apps. But the one place where content has been lacking has been in the TV space. And that brings us to the big AT&T Time Warner merger. Now AT&T picking up content. What do you think of that in light of Apple's ambitions?
Well, I mean, we know that Apple we knew this a few months ago. Apple had some conversations with Time Warner, very tentative conversations, we think, about a possible acquisition. It may have been it was just focused on HBO. I think the problem is that Apple, as brilliant story on this a few months ago from our colleagues over at the Wall Street Journal, Apple's been trying for a long time to build essentially a Netflix-like competitor. They think that's what it is. But of course, the whole video content industry has seen what happened in the music industry, namely that Apple is the biggest player in that industry now, is the gatekeeper to a lot of music content. And music was in something of a crisis 10 years ago when iTunes launched and the iPod came out because of Napster and similar, downloading platforms. The difference is that television and film are not in the same crisis. They
Exactly.
do not need Apple to help them deliver content to the consumer. So they are less willing to give Apple the opportunity to do that. That, of course, then means that how is Apple going to get this video content which makes it the go-to place for your videos, for your television shows and your films? Well, it has somehow to generate perhaps its own content. That might entail buying the likes of a Time Warner or any other given studio. But of course then creates further problems, clearly,
Right.
that if it's competing with other studios, then why should they give them the content as well?
Exactly, and they already have deals with all these studios to get the iTunes rentals for TV shows and movies. So it's very interesting that they have to strike that balance there. And it's sort of, you talked about the Google Pixel earlier, it almost feels like Google having to balance the Android ecosystem with their own phone, and Apple having the same predicament in terms of building their own content, buying content, etc. It'll be interesting to see how it works out in the end.
It'll be interesting to see as well how they grow this video content they're doing already. They are already making a few television shows kind of focused on music and apps. There's the, I'm afraid to say, slightly embarrassingly named, I think at least, Planet of the Apps. And they are making a drama with Dr. Dre, who of course was an executive at Beats, the headphone maker and music platform they acquired. That's going to be a fictional drama of some nature. So there are some tentative steps there already, but nowhere near the sort of, I think, $5 billion that Amazon and Netflix are talking about investing in new content.
And it will take them decades in order to build up, if they so choose, and of course they have the money to do so, a whole content network, sort of like some of the TV stations that AT&T is getting in this Time Warner acquisition. Do you think they'll go down that route, just start pouring billions of dollars into that?
I mean, there was a comment from Tim Cook about the willingness to do deals of any size if it made strategic sense. He did also say that owning content is very important. I heard an analyst joke once that the best way for Apple to really get people using Apple Television would be to buy every single NFL team, which they could afford to do, and then they would own all NFL content, which I think is the most watched sport in the US.
They should buy the NBA as well. I'd love to have the Lakers on the Apple TV and not have to pay $200 to League Pass.
I think I should tell all viewers that this is perhaps the only 15 minutes of any given day when Mark isn't talking about the Lakers. It's his second favorite topic after Apple.
That's true. That's true.
Let's move on to the next topic. Still keen to hear any questions you guys might have, and that's the product event tomorrow. We're both going to be there. Mark's broken a lot of news already and what is to be anticipated. Maybe you want to give us a flavor again, remind us what we're going to see?
Sure. Alex and I have written a bunch of this. It's a real team effort here. I think we're doing a great job on the news. We've reported that Apple's working on a new MacBook Pro, a new MacBook Air, new monitors, in collaboration with LG Electronics out of South Korea, new iMacs. So we're expecting the MacBook Pro, though, to be the highlight. This will be the first overhaul of Apple's premier laptop. This is a computer that ranges from $1,800 to $3,000, depending on the upgrades. We're hearing there's going to be a very big upgrade. There's going to be an OLED display strip at the top of the keyboard to replace the standard function keys. No escape key. I've seen a few people online freaking out about that on Twitter. But it's going to be digital, shortcuts. Let's say you're editing a movie. The bar will suggest, slice a clip, a more intuitive volume controller. If you're in iTunes, you'll get music playback controls. I think it's very interesting, and it feels to me like they're sort of using this MacBook Pro as sort of like a playground, because they sell less of them, of new different innovations coming out of their R&D labs.
I mean, I hate to add a layer of cynicism or skepticism, but I'm still not entirely sure what the huge advantage of the OLED strip is. It seems to me a little bit gimmicky. I'm open to being proved wrong. Hopefully we'll get our hands on the thing tomorrow.
Right. I mean, there's this overall vision where Apple wants everyone to have an iPad, but that hasn't worked out yet. But of course, the iPad has so many benefits being a touchscreen. They can change the software. They can add buttons without having to ship new ones through software. And so they've seen that the iPad sales, as you've written about, have slowed. Growth has stalled. So if they have to start moving pieces of the iPad to the products like the Mac that have remained resilient, and over time they can continue merging it. I think this is the first step of convergence.
I do also wonder whether there are economies of scale. We are expecting the iPhone next year to have an OLED screen, and I wonder if they're buying the same OLED components or organic light-emitting diode. That's what the strip is going to be made out of. I wonder if they're using the same suppliers and can then engineer some discounts and make it a little cheaper for themselves.
Right, and before the Apple Watch, one of the features of the first watch is that it had this sapphire crystal, not really scratchable cover over the display. And that display was OLED. It's a very small 1.5-inch OLED display. Over time, they're sort of moving those to more products. So they're moving from the small Apple Watch OLED to the MacBook Pro OLED. Obviously, these are smaller volume products, but this is good preparation for testing the waters and production before they come out with the OLED iPhones next year, which we've reported on with our colleagues in Asia.
We have a question here, backtracking slightly to the television topic, asking why Apple doesn't have TV show rentals anymore. I'm not sure they ever did in Europe while I was there, and I've only been here a few months. I mean, my thoughts are certainly that, I don't know, I'm inclined only to watch a TV show once, and so therefore they're just making less money on each one than they might otherwise do. I don't know if you think differently.
That sounds right, and you're right. In the US, when the previous version of the Apple TV, before it was reinvented a few years ago with the new black one, you would have to rent a TV show. It was about 99 cents. You can watch it for a 30-day period, but only watch it up to 24 hours. So when you start it, you have 24 hours, but you have 30 days to start watching it. They got rid of that. Now you have to actually buy the shows. In that way, they can charge $1.99, $2.99, $3.99. But also the advantage here is they can sell you a sort of subscription, like to complete series. So there's two factors going on here. It's more beneficial to Apple's bottom line, being able to charge $1 or $2 more. Also, but the user, on the other hand, gets to keep it, watch it whenever, and it gives them access to buying series or seasons in bulk. So it's a win-win on both sides.
I think from a business perspective, it makes a lot more sense to Apple to be selling at the higher price product, and of course, if you're buying a series subscription, you've locked them into a certain amount of spending.
Yep.
I can also appreciate, though, why from a user perspective, it might be a little bit frustrating that, I only had to pay 99 cents before, and now I've got to pay up to $3 a pop.
Right, but at the same time, they sort of balanced it out because movies actually flip-flopped. Before, movies, you had to buy them. Now you can rent movies. I rent a movie on the Apple TV maybe 3-4 times a week before I go to bed. I think it's an amazing service. You rent the movie, it's between $4 and $7, depending on how new it is or the quality of the streaming, HD or not, through iTunes. You have 30 days to watch it with 24 hours. And movies sometimes cost $19 or $29, $15. And if you want to watch it a couple times for $3.99, you're still saving money in the long run. So I actually think that the movie rentals through iTunes on the Apple TV, it's actually one of my favorite use cases for Apple products, really.
A few more questions here. Will there be iPad upgrades? Not tomorrow, right?
Right, no, there's no iPad upgrades tomorrow. We've reported previously that there will be an iPad hardware update with a faster display, sort of easier to manipulate, as soon as next year, as well as some professional apps. But there will be a new iPad app, right? Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, this sort of plays into Apple's ambitions to own the television space slightly. It's going to be some sort of recommendations app which pulls your viewing habits and then makes recommendations about what you might watch next. Now, of course, at the moment, if you rent or watch a film, it does say at the bottom, these are similar. I think the more interesting takeaway from this potential app on Apple TV is that it shows that they are using your data on some level. They are parsing your viewing habits, and they've been very, very careful about doing that. We don't yet know the details of it, whether it's doing it within the app or in the cloud, or if they're using this differential privacy, which makes it very hard for them to tell who is supplying what data. But it shows they are using purchasing habits to make recommendations.
Right, and sort of like what Tim Cook said on the call yesterday, Apple doesn't think that there has to be a balance between privacy and AI, these recommendation engines. They think that they can do it without having privacy implications on the negative end. So maybe we'll see more of that tomorrow.
And I think it's good that, it's going to be interesting to compare what recommendations Amazon and Google are making compared to what Apple's are making.
It's like who's better at it. And
frankly, yeah. I mean, sometimes I think Netflix is in some ways very smart at this. I tend to think that, I'm interested in the artsy European cinema, art house cinema films. Unfortunately, Netflix knows me rather better, and I keep on getting Steven Seagal recommendations, which is painfully embarrassing.
And the difference is that Netflix's whole business was founded upon issuing streaming content around this recommendation engine. Previously it was DVDs, but now it's around the recommendation engine. For Apple, this is sort of a throw-in, so we'll see how well they do it. They've been working on this for a while, so it seems likely that if they're coming out with it tomorrow, they're pretty confident that it's going to do pretty all right.
We've got another question. How do you think the event will affect the Apple stock? Realistically,
Rarely does, right?
it rarely does. A lot of it, as we know, we've reported already. And secondly, bear in mind, Apple is the iPhone company. iPhones represent about 2/3 of all their sales. So that means that anything that happens in the Mac space has to be blockbuster.
Right.
And, they've said themselves they don't want people in the next few decades to be buying laptops. They want to be buying tablets. And so,
and the thing is that Apple sort of, between a couple million, sells around 5 million Macs a quarter. And they're not going to start selling 10 million Macs a quarter or 8 million Macs a quarter because of this. But it does show continued dedication to a line that has shown resiliency in this world of tablets that Steve Jobs heralded 5 years ago. So they're continuing to show the dedication. Apple's done nothing except coming out with a rose gold faster version 12-inch MacBook in April since the spring of 2015. So this is showing that their dedicated professionals are still cared about. And we'll see how long the update cadence is now after it's been a year and a half. Is this going to become a year and a half, a 2-year thing now? Are they slowing down Mac updates? I think we'll get a little bit of a clearer picture about that tomorrow.
I think one thing that is quite interesting is this idea of owning the FaceTime with the consumer. And particularly as we move towards voice virtual assistants, voice-activated virtual assistants. So Siri is now in the Mac OS,
Yep.
and that was only introduced earlier this year. And so it's more time when you are engaging with that virtual assistant potentially, as long as they perhaps improve it quite substantially, rather than using Amazon Alexa, Google Assistant.
Right, and I think Siri on the iPhone has gained a lot of new features, on the iPad as well over the last few years. The Mac version have been using it in Sierra. I think there's still some work to be done, but clearly the foundation of them wanting the Mac to be voice-driven as well is there. It'll be interesting to see the comparisons, if we ever find this data, of how many people with an iPhone with Siri and a Mac with Siri, what do they use Siri for on the Mac versus what they use it on the iPhone?
Yeah, that'll be interesting. It's hard clearly for us to gauge
Right,
that, but we
right.
can only use our personal experience. One more question, and then I think we'll wrap up.
Sure.
Mac Mini, is it dead?
Mac Mini, is it dead? Well, they haven't really updated it since 2014. The Mac Pro since 2013. If it's updated, I don't know. I think we'll have to, find out tomorrow. Certainly, we haven't reported it's going to be updated. There is a lot of interest in the product, but who knows if Apple sells enough that it's worth updating or overhauling. I know you have one, right?
I have one, and but that's I've had mine a few years because I didn't have an Apple TV, and so I was using it into my television. I think possibly if it's almost analogous to the iPhone SE. It's at a lower price point than other Mac products,
right?
And so it brings the average sales point down for people who want to get a Mac. I can get a cheap screen from someone else, and I was able to get a Mac for
Which
sort of
is
$500.
not necessarily a good thing for Apple's ASPs.
Exactly.
Results.
So average selling price, sorry, is what ASP.
Right. So I don't know. That's a good question. I doubt it. I doubt it'll get stage time, but it's very possible they could silently update it online for the people who do still want those computers. Because, it's not worth the backlash of not getting the updates at some point. They're still good for servers. People love connecting them to their big screens. But in an Apple TV world, we'll see. We'll see.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in. We hope to see you the same time next week. Please do follow us on Twitter. We're @Technology. That's for Bloomberg's whole technology team. And thank you for joining us.
And hopefully next week we'll have one of those MacBook Pros in hand. So.
Right.
Yeah.
There's no sexism, no racism, so great success.
I love it.